Enter pretty much any classroom in the modern Western world during literacy time, and you are almost guaranteed to see students engaging in silent reading at some point. As a teacher, I have my students engage in Dear Time, drop everything and read, on a daily basis. Similarly, enter a library or bookshop, and you will most likely discover the same trend. Would this shock you? Chances are no. The majority of reading we do today is silent. So much so that before this assignment, it is something I never thought of. You can see silent reading everywhere, from our homes to coffee shops and public transit. Whether you are reading a book, a newspaper, or you are on a tablet or phone, chances are you are reading silently. Unless, of course, you are sharing a stellar internet meme with a friend. But how did this all start? How did silent reading develop to be our predominant form of reading? As I take you back on this journey, I will tell you that this was a long and winding process that was both impacted by and in turn impacted huge fundamental changes in how humans thought of writing and reading. While researching a topic I had never previously thought about, I was overwhelmed by the breadth of information, and for the purpose of this video, I am focusing on the development of silent reading into the modality of reading it is today and the implications that it had. I will also be focusing mostly on the development in the West, but it is important to note that different areas of the world had their own journeys that happened at their own paces and times. Reading, like any human activity, has a history. When we go back to the time of antiquity, we discover that Greek literature was intended for public delivery or performance, and that the foundation of the educational process was rhetoric, and the aim of the educational process was eloquence. In fact, writing served largely to recycle knowledge back into the oral world, and public readings were important social gatherings. Ancient readers in the West, in order to be successful, had to read orally and slowly due to the lack of word separation. This writing style, called scriptura continua, resulted in what Sanger refers to as an onerous task of search and rescue. Imagine, if you will, if all of the text we read were formatted something like this. Would you find reading it to be more difficult and a more time-consuming process? How differently would the reading experience be? I, for one, notice that when I read it out loud, it is much easier to read the text, although not necessarily comprehend it. This is often what those who studied the ancient history and development of reading and writing have noted, and which I will examine in more detail later on. Sanger continues to explain that ancient reading habits were profoundly oral and rhetorical, as well as being focused on a limited number of highly studied texts. As well, the idea that more people should be able to read independently was a completely absent concept in ancient times. It is important to note that while silent reading was not in any form of prominence and was more rare during antiquity than during modern times, it was not completely absent. In fact, many historians agree that it did exist alongside with oral reading, just not anywhere near the same level. Some of the first recorded instances of silent reading have been used to prove the bewilderment one experienced while encountering silent reading, such as in St. Augustine's account of Ambrose. He and his peers were quite perplexed to see that when Ambrose was reading, his eyes glided over the pages, and his heart searched out the sense, but his voice and tongue were at rest. And the reasons for such could most likely be to rest his voice or to keep the profound thoughts the author expressed to himself. In fact, many classical researchers disagree over the meaning and bewilderment of St. Augustine, stating that it was not due to St. Augustine being shocked and not understanding the concept of silent reading, but rather due to the standoffish manner of his fellow monk. For all of the intellectual arguments over the frequency of occurrence that silent reading had during antiquity, it most definitely was not anywhere near the level that silent reading is used now. So, how did this shift happen? When did it happen? What precipitated it, and what ramifications did it have? The general shift towards silent reading, simplistically speaking, began during the long centuries of the Middle Ages and was restricted to monastic scribes. Then into universities, and later on during the 14th and 15th centuries to lay aristocrats and men of letters, to finally even the most humblest of readers, which you can see was quite a long path. Now let's examine some of those different factors that influenced the shift. A fundamental change in thinking also contributed to the increase of silent reading. This change, which was an exceedingly long process, was the idea of the written word being honored and viewed as its own medium. Previously, the written word was viewed as merely a record of the spoken word, and as it became thought of as a way of preserving the records of the past and church traditions, so its importance and existence in its own entity rose. One of the factors that led to the increasing use of silent reading was scholasticism. As scholars wanted to delve deeper into texts and understand them more, silent reading was found to help this, as it proved to be faster and lead to deeper understanding. In addition to this, the deep examination and reflection of texts were seen as improving one's knowledge of God and therefore also improving their chances of salvation. With Christianity's early adoption of the Codex, which transitioned reading to a similar book form that we use today, texts were now easier to reread, study, memorize, and analyze. As the idea of reading and the book changed, so did the necessity to change the way the text was displayed, since oral recitation could no longer always be relied upon or wanted. Now there were spaces between words, graphic conventions that guided the eye around the pages in a specific order, and punctuation. Another shift began to occur. A wider variety of texts began to emerge to hone in on different audiences. Reading was not just for scholarly or divine purposes anymore, but also for pleasure. Now there were simplified versions of texts, ones aimed directly at women, escapist texts. Texts gradually came to be enjoyed by a public of less intellectual refinement, whose reading was approximate and who read for the basic situations of love, adventure, and fantastic events, with only relative interest in its coherence. One also saw an increased literacy during the Roman Empire, which saw new opportunities for reading such as signs, pamphlets, and even graffiti. The general increased literacy and broader circulation created even more demand for books, and to the creation of public libraries, which in turn boosted literacy. When you look around, it is hard to find examples of people engaging in a type of reading that isn't silent. How thoroughly this reading modality has integrated into our everyday lives is incredible considering its long and slow journey. Silent reading allowed for a huge revolution in how people interacted with writing. Their interactions became more internal, freer, and even secretive. The critical thinking and individual interpretation that silent reading allowed was fundamental to the Reformation theologians and revolutionary ideas. Isolated private readings became so important in stimulating religious zeal amongst merchant and aristocratic families that within 3 generations, and with the addition of the printing press, those same families would be supporting men such as John Calvin. When you think of that, it is impossible to deny the impact that silent reading has had. From potentially huge moments in history to a child in 2014 being taken to imaginary worlds from the comfort of their bedroom.